Okay, welcome back. We're continuing now with aquatic biomes. So we've looked at terrestrial, all those different biomes on land. So now we're going to take that and look at what diversity there is in what's found in our aquatic ecosystems. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the global distribution and principal environmental aspects of aquatic biomes. So we're going to do this for the 6 aquatic biomes, and we're going to look at them and categorize them by their depth, their salinity, so how much salt there is, and the flow. Are they stagnant, not moving? Are they flowing? We're going to start with freshwater, and we're going to start with the 2 biomes that are flowing, so streams and rivers. So no 2 streams or rivers are the same, and the conditions and the organisms can vary even within the same biome. So it could depend on the location, if you're upstream or upriver, are you downstream or downriver, the amount of canopy, so there's a lot of canopy over top of your stream or river. That's going to affect the amount of sunlight which is hitting the water, which affects the amount of producers that can live in there. The depth, the velocity, so how fast your stream is flowing, how much water is available in your stream or in your river. The turbidity is how much sediment is kicked up and moving around in that water. And then lastly, the salinity. So there's going to be some changes in the amount of salt as we get closer to the ocean. So I want to draw your attention to this image here of the different parts of a stream or a river. So we kind of break them up into 3 parts. The first is their headwaters, where they begin, and up here they're flowing out of the mountains, so they may be flowing swiftly, and the water could be moving a lot more rapidly. But as they get to this second zone, they transfer to a lower elevation, and this is where we see them to kind of slow down and what we call meander. So they may start curving as they get closer to the ocean. And then last we get our depositional zone. So this is where they're at their lowest elevation. The river gets to flat valleys. We have flood plains, and then we get deltas where they deposit all those sediments that they've taken with them out of the mountain. And this is a really important ecosystem and biome. So in contrast to that, our freshwater biomes also include lakes and ponds, and these are the standing water biomes. So we can kind of describe these based upon their depth, because depth affects the light penetration, so how far the light can get, and that changes the entire diversity of a lake or pond ecosystem. So some terms to know here, we've got something called littoral zone. This is where the diversity is of all the life you find in a pond. So there's a lot of vegetation, it's shallower, you're going to have a lot of different fish species hanging out over there, excuse me, compared to the limnetic zone here in the center. So this is our open water. It's where a lot of photosynthesis happens. You may find some larger fish, but because this is the open water, there's not the safety of the shores and all the vegetation, so there's not as much diversity. And then we've got what's called the profundal zone down here below the limnetic zone. This is where the light can't penetrate, so we said the depth affects the light penetration. So if the lake or pond is deep enough, you're not going to get that light penetration. So very few fish, you may have catfish hanging down there. And no light means no photosynthesis, which means there's low levels of oxygen. And then at the very bottom here in the sediments, we have the benthic zone. This is where our decomposers hang out. Some of these phases are pretty similar to our marine ecosystem. So we're going to start by looking at the ocean. And the ocean is affected by the depth and the light. Again, we said depth affects the light penetrance, and the ocean is way deeper than lakes and ponds, so that's a pretty important factor. They're also affected by the amount of nutrients that are available and the salinity. So the ocean is not a consistent amount of salt everywhere you go. It does change. So I want to call your attention to a few important parts. So we've got here our pelagic realm here, and this is our open ocean. So open ocean is equivalent to like an ocean desert. Open ocean does not have a lot of different diversity going on there because there's not a lot to support a lot of life. This is where our phytoplankton are. They're producing all the oxygen to support the food webs, but they aren't able to support a lot of biodiversity of species hanging out there. So we've got the benthic realm down here on the seafloor. This is the similar to the pond and the lakes. Little no light gets down here. This is our decomposers and our animals that don't mind not having a lot of light and living at the bottom, maybe less oxygen levels. So we can also divide the ocean up into two different parts based upon their light. So we have the photic, so think photo, has light, and the aphotic zone, there's no light down here. So in the area with no light, they have more nutrients, but they have less dissolved oxygen, more nutrients because there's less species diversity, and then less nutrients in that photic zone, but a high amount of dissolved oxygen because that's where the photosynthesis is taking place. The next and maybe most widely known marine habitat is the coral reef. So the coral reef is found along the shore, closer to the shore, but it's a benthic habitat. So it's found in shallow oceans, gets a lot of light, has the highest biodiversity. So if you can just look at these pictures, you see how many different species there are. And corals require sunlight because they're in a symbiotic relationship with algae. So we've got the calcium shells, skeletons of the coral reef, and then they take in photosynthetic algae in a symbiotic relationship. Now we also have what's called a marshland. So this is a coastal wetland, meaning the soils are covered with water all or part of the year. The water is brackish, which means it has some salt in it, so it's saltier than fresh water, but not as salty as ocean water. The animals and species you find here are adapted to tides, so the water is going to be moving in and out, so there's times where they may be completely exposed to the sun, other times where they're completely covered. And they're mostly grasses, so you're not going to find a lot of trees here. If we have a lot of trees, we call that a swamp. And they're highly productive and they have a high level of biodiversity. And then we have an estuary. So you may know estuary better by the term bay or inlet or sound. So here we have the Long Island Sound, or you may be familiar with the Narragansett Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary system. So estuaries are that point where that flowing freshwater stream or river meets the ocean. So remember in that picture we saw as it meandered down to sea level, there was that delta area. So this is our estuary. They have tides, which affects their depth and salinity. But they're very fertile ecosystems because they're bringing all that nutrients down out of the mountains and through the rivers. So they have a high productivity and species richness. So a lot of species like to have their larval stages for fish and shellfish in these estuaries because it's more protected and there's the high nutrients. So it's important to know that we're familiar with trees and plants on land supporting our ecosystems, but in these aquatic ecosystems, the algae supplies a large portion of the Earth's oxygen and takes in a large amount of carbon dioxide. So it's very important to the global cycling of all of our chemicals and nutrients. So to summarize, our goal was to describe the global distribution and principal environmental aspects of aquatic biomes. So we can summarize this by saying that the freshwater systems can be divided into flowing, the rivers and streams, and standing water, the lakes and ponds. And these can vary by their temperature, their light, and the turbidity, remember the amount of sediments in them, which impacts the amount of nutrients, dissolved oxygen, and biodiversity in these habitats. The distribution of fish also varies on some combination of the temperature, the amount of salt, the nutrient availability, and the depth. And lastly, that algae is the primary producer for the oceans and produces a large amount of oxygen and takes in a large amount of carbon dioxide.